morning, everyone. Thanks for joining in tonight. And we are going to study the Gospels tonight over the next couple of weeks. By the way, sorry, I forgot to turn the music on until about halfway through that countdown. And hope you like that countdown. It's some children countdowns, and hope you got all of the questions answered correctly. But we are going to study the four Gospels. We're going to start tonight with the Gospel of Mark, and I'm going to share some things with you about that Gospel. It's going to be a little different in the way that I have to do some things on the screen. Hopefully, it'll all work out okay, and we have to move between several different programs tonight as we go through this. So, but let's kind of jump into this, and I will be here this week discussing the book of Mark. Jeff will be the next 2 weeks covering Matthew and Luke, and then I will be back on the fourth week of this series to cover the Gospel of John. So really looking forward to that. I've really enjoyed this study, getting ready for the Mark study. Got all my notes here, and hopefully we can get through all of these without a problem. So the first question, as we kind of get into this, is here are the things that we're going to try to cover tonight. And if you have a question, by the way, put it in the chat box on Facebook. I'm monitoring those. Put it in the YouTube channel, Facebook, or send me a text. Let me set my phone right there so I can see it. If I get a text, send me a text, or send me a, you can call me on the phone if you want. I don't care. It'll just be delayed a little bit if you're watching. So, we're going to talk about the author who wrote the book of Mark, and I know Mark wrote the book of Mark, right? We're going to talk about why we feel that way. Recipients who he was writing the book to, circumstances, maybe what was going on for him to write the gospel, and then kind of special characteristics about the gospel. We'll spend more time there than we'll spend in the other places. So we'll jump right into this. Who is the author of the Gospel of Mark? And the obvious answer to that is Mark, most likely John Mark. It's very interesting if you were to look at the text itself, and I didn't even pull the text up here, but if you, let me get this fixed for you really quick. If you look at the biblical text itself, it just says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. So if you look at the book itself, it doesn't tell you who wrote the book. But the manuscripts that we have, the codexes, they have according to Mark at the beginning. So because of that, we feel like Mark wrote the book. I think there's good evidence for that. So it is most likely, I think, John Mark. You first run across John Mark in Acts chapter 12, verse 12. And in that verse, it says that when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary. This is when Peter's released from prison. He went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered and were praying. And then we know, with reference to Mark, in Acts chapter 15, verse 37, Paul goes on another journey. And there's a dispute between Barnabas and Paul about taking John Mark along with him. And so you kind of know, I hope you kind of know that background. So Acts chapter 12, in verse 12, he shows up. He goes with Paul and Barnabas on part of a missionary journey. He returns home for some reason. And then when they get ready to go on the next missionary journey, Barnabas wants to take Mark along again. Paul does not. They have a disagreement. Paul goes one way with Silas. Barnabas goes the other direction with John Mark. And later in Colossians chapter 4, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions, if he comes to you, welcome him. So I think this is the same Mark. So you find out he's a cousin of Barnabas, which might explain why Barnabas was so insistent about him going along the next time. And then in Philemon, one of the prison epistles that Paul writes, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends greetings to you, and so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. So whatever disagreement Paul had with John Mark, it seems like that was corrected. And then when he was in prison, which was most likely in Rome, I think, then John Mark was also present there with him. And so Peter, on the other hand, after the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, Peter is not referenced again. I know you're thinking, okay, with John Mark, we're talking about Paul, talking about Peter. So here's kind of the scenario. Okay, John Mark ends up in Rome, where Paul is. Peter kind of drops out of Acts after Acts chapter 15. It's mostly about the missionary journeys of Paul. But when Peter writes 1 Peter chapter 5, she who is at Babylon, which Babylon was a name for Rome, who is likewise chosen, she is the church, sends you greetings, as does Mark, my son. So evidently, John Mark was also in Rome when Paul was in Rome, and also Peter is in Rome during part of that time. So there's this interesting quote. I want to show you this actually in another program. This is from one of the the Nicene and post-Nicene followers. This is Eusebius is actually writing this. And as Eusebius writes this, he's writing about John Mark, and he's writing about some things that actually most likely the Apostle John had to say. He's talking about John up here in this earlier section. I wanted you to see this section right here. It is also, starting reading right here at 15. It is in the following words, this also the presbyter, which most think is John, that's who he's been talking about, the Apostle John, said, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of the hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error, while thus he wrote some things as he remembered them, for he was careful of one thing, not to admit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely. These things are related by Papias concerning Mark. So Eusebius quotes Papias, who thinks that Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark from the teaching and from the instruction of Peter. There's one thing that he said in there, though, that I think I slightly disagree with. That is that Mark did not hear Jesus or follow Jesus. And this is just a personal thought. And I gave you the wrong reference here. This is not 1 Peter 14. This is actually, since I did that, let me pull it up in the text. This is Mark chapter 14. I'll go back over the text. So this is Mark chapter 14, verse 51. Let me fix this just a little bit. All right, so that was not what I wanted to do. There we go. So this is Mark chapter 14:51, reading here at the top of the screen. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. That is not in any other gospel except the Gospel of Mark. And I personally think that young man would have been, I think it would have been John Mark. I don't know that. It doesn't identify him. I just think that it's in Mark's gospel. He would have been a young man at that time. I just think because that is in the Gospel of Mark that is actually John Mark. So I think maybe he heard Jesus. I don't know if he was a follower of Jesus or a believer of Jesus. Obviously, in the early church in Jerusalem. His mother was, so I think he probably became a follower of Jesus. I mean, of course he did. I just, where Eusebius is quoting Papias and said that he didn't know Jesus or follow Jesus before he heard the teaching of Peter. I'm just not sure that is right. I think that that maybe he had some exposure to Jesus before that. There's also this prologue in several old Latin manuscripts, and of course this is not scripture, but it's an interesting insight into history. It says, Mark declared he was called stump-fingered because he had rather small fingers in comparison with the stature of the rest of his body. He was the interpreter of Peter, and after the death of Peter himself, he wrote down this same gospel in the regions of Italy. So I think probably from all of that, it's probably pretty safe to say that that Mark is probably John Mark is the writer of the Gospel of Mark, and he wrote down his understanding of the life of Jesus, most likely from eyewitnesses' accounts of Peter. So I think as you read the Gospel of Mark, you're really getting kind of a look into how Peter viewed Jesus' ministry, and as Mark writes to his recipients, he's looking at it from Peter's point of view. So who did he write the Gospel of Mark to? You got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark is actually written, I think it's written to Christians who are in the Roman region, to Greeks and Romans, but specifically those who were in Rome. A couple of interesting things about Mark. Mark does not record a genealogy, much like Matthew does and Luke does, and Jeff will talk about that next week. But if he's writing to a group of Christians who are in Rome or Gentile believers, then there's not as much reason for him to create this connection to the lineage of David, the lineage of Abraham. Of course, he's the Messiah, but there wouldn't have been such an important reason to do that. So I think that's one of the reasons Lee leaves it out, is because of the audience that he's writing to. I think it's very Roman in character. It's interesting in Mark chapter 15, verse 21. Mark gives you, we'll talk about this in a few minutes, with a lot of examples. Mark gives a lot of detail that sometimes the other writers don't give. So in Mark chapter 15, 21, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. And it's very interesting, and when Paul writes Romans 16:13, greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too. So I think that Rufus is the same individual, and I think this is just another indication that as Mark writes his gospel, when he inserted the name of Rufus there, and it would have made that connection to the Roman believers because they would have known who Rufus was. Now, here's another reason I think it's primarily written to Roman and Greek audience as opposed to a Jewish audience. There's some Latinisms in the text, and what I mean by that is there are places where he uses a Greek word, and then he follows it up with a loan word that is actually a Latin loan word, which Latin would have been spoken in Rome. A poor widow came in and put in 2 small copper coins, and the word that he uses for coin there is a Greek word, which means smallest denomination of money. And then he writes, which is a penny. And when he writes a penny, what he does is he uses a Latin loan word. So he takes a Greek word, which the word for coin, and he compares that to a Latin word, which is a word for a penny. And it wouldn't make much sense for Mark to do that if he wasn't writing to an audience who primarily knew Latin or from a Greek background. He does the same thing in Mark chapter 15, verse 16. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace. That is the governor's headquarters. He writes a Greek word, and then he gives a Latin loan word. I don't know that I need to explain that. A loan word is a word you take from one language and you start to use in another language. I'd give you some English examples, but right now I can't think of any. If you know, I'm throwing in the chat box. And they called together the whole battalion. So he does that, and then when he gets to certain Aramaic phrases, he gives an explanation of that because the Roman group that he would be writing to wouldn't understand all of the Aramaic expressions. James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is the sons of thunder. So he gives an Aramaic word, but then he has to explain what it would mean. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. So he gives a Latin, what Jesus said in Aramaic, and then he gives a explanation of what that Aramaic phrase would mean. And Jesus on the cross, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephatha, that is, be opened. I'm sorry, that's Mark 7. That's he's talking about eyes there. But in Mark 15:22, he does the same thing. Oh, I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself. They brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. So he gives a name, or he gives a word in Aramaic, or something that would have been known in Palestine, and then he explains it with another term. At the ninth hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So he takes that Hebrew Aramaic phrase, and then he translates it, which means so that they will understand what that terminology meant. So all of that, I think, points to the fact that he was writing to an audience that really wasn't really familiar with Aramaic or Hebrew, or even the traditions of a lot of the Jewish people, or even the traditions of Palestine. You see that reflected in Mark chapter 7. He's talking about the Pharisees and cleaning outside of the cups. So he gives an explanation. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. There are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. Now, maybe you look at that and you think, okay, Mark was putting that in the text for us so that years later we would know about those traditions, but most likely Mark was putting that information in the text so that his readers would know, or those who are listening to his gospel would know, this is the background that caused this disagreement in the ministry of Jesus. So when you go through those and you start looking at how he explains certain things and gives detailed explanations of certain things, I just think that falls in line with Mark's audience was a Roman Greek audience that did not understand all of the intricacies of life in Palestine, or the language of Aramaic, or the language of Hebrew. So I think Mark wrote it, and I think he wrote it to a Roman primarily / Greek audience. And and then one question comes, well, why would he have written the gospel? If he actually wrote it after the death of Peter, which, if tradition is right, Peter would have died in Nero's persecution around AD 66, then a couple of the circumstances. One would be if Paul had been, if John Mark had been listening to Peter's preaching, then maybe he's recording the content of Peter's preaching, and if he is, Peter was a great storyteller. Peter, if this is coming from the mind of Peter, and then John Mark is writing it down so that it'll be present. Peter was a great storyteller, and we'll see more detail about that in a few minutes. And if it actually was after Nero's persecution, or even during that time, it's this encouragement that he has during the persecution. There is a text I wanted you to see, if I can find it here. This is actually from Tacitus in the Annals, and this just kind of tells you what was going on during that background, kind of the historical background. There was a fire in Rome. There was some suspicion that Nero himself had set the fire. It caused an enormous amount of damage. And this is something that Tacitus wrote after. He wrote about 100 AD, 105 AD. So he's pretty close to, he's pretty early. And this is what he's writing about after the fire. I'll start reading right here. You can follow along. Such indeed were the precautions of human wisdom. And the next thing, they're talking about how to deal with the fire. The next thing was to seek means of propitiating the gods, and the recourse was had to the Sibylline books, by the direction of which prayers were offered to Vulcanus, Ceres, and Proserpina. Juno too was entreated by the matrons, first in the capital and then on the nearest part of the coast, whence water was procured to sprinkle the fane and image of the goddess. And there were scattered banquets and nightly vigils celebrated by married women, but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the empire, and all the propitiation of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was a result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. So that's just what was happening at Nero's persecution. It says here Nero offered his garden for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus. Hence, I did want to read this. Hence, for even criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. So if John Mark wrote the gospel during all of that persecution, you will see there's some encouragement about persecution that occurs in the gospel of the gospel of Mark, and the way he writes that. So let's just kind of look as we go through here, a couple of other things. So, special characteristics. I think if you read through the Gospel of Mark, and I know we're accustomed to reading it, right? We have it in our Bible. We open the Bible up and we read the Bible. But several people have noted through the years, and I think it's a really good point. It's almost like the Gospel of Mark is designed to be read out loud. There was an interesting statement. And this was, I don't remember where, R.T. France wrote this, and I just read it to you. I think it's an interesting perspective. And I guess his statistics are right. I'm not really sure. I've never looked into this. It may seem obvious that a book is intended to be read, but modern scholars are apt to forget that in the ancient world, not very many people could read. It has recently been estimated that literacy in the ancient Mediterranean world was probably no more than 10%, although the figure may have risen to 15 or 20% in certain cities. Unless Mark's work was designed only for the benefit of the small minority who could read, he must have reckoned on its being experienced by most of his target group as an oral text read aloud, probably in meetings of the local church. And I think that's a really great insight. thanks to R.T. France for bringing that to our attention. But it really, when you read the Gospel of Mark, it's like a storytelling book. Like Mark is this great storyteller, or Peter was this great storyteller. And I don't mean story in that it's untrue. I mean that some people just have a way of just weaving a story together and taking all of the details and making it sound so exciting and having you right on the edge of your seat. And you see that, we'll look at this in more detail in a few minutes, but like Mark chapter 5, he gives all of this detail about healing this man in the tombs, where Matthew condenses it down into a pretty small area, and Mark does that. It's like a story that he gives you details that other people just do not give you. And because of that, I think it probably, modern scholarship may be right. Maybe the idea as Mark wrote down his gospel was this is going to be read and people are going to be listening to it, and he writes it that way. Another kind of special characteristic, especially if it has to do with a persecution that is going on in Rome and the struggle of the disciples, Mark highlights the struggle of the disciples more than some of the other writers do. For example, in Mark chapter 5, verse 31, when the crowd is pressing around Jesus, and this is the woman with the issue of blood, and his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around and you say, who touched me? Just that the disciples would ask that type of question. Or if you, or in Mark chapter 9, in that section, and I'll show you this real quick. This is where Jesus has been up on the mountain of transfiguration, and he comes down, and so they kept the matter to themselves. Up at the top of the next page, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. And so as Peter goes through, as Mark goes through this, he kind of highlights some of these struggles that the apostles had with understanding exactly what Jesus was saying and exactly what Jesus was doing. And that's really interesting if you're looking at it from Peter's perspective, because if John Mark is writing from Peter's perspective, then at least Peter, he's willing to express the struggles that they had with understanding the words of Jesus, or the struggle they had with grasping his teaching, or understanding exactly what he was doing. In Mark chapter 10, they were bringing the children that he might touch them, and the disciples rebuked them. But when Jesus saw it, he was indignant and said to them, let the children come to me. So it's another one of those instances where something is happening, and we think the disciples might instantly understand it, but they don't. They struggle to be dedicated followers of Jesus. And I think that has great meaning if Peter is writing to a group who's undergoing persecution after the fire in Rome, and Nero's blaming the fire on the Christians. The Christians are being persecuted, and they're struggling to stay faithful, and they're struggling to stay true. And Mark, writing the gospel and the recollections of Peter, is saying, look, even the disciples struggled to understand exactly what Jesus was doing. And Mark seems to highlight that more than any other. Another thing that Mark does is he stresses the humanity of Jesus, but he balances it out with this idea of the Son of Man. Here are just some examples. For Jesus is angry, he eats, he drinks, he's hungry, he sleeps, he touches people, he's touched by people, he grieves, and he has a human body. And so Mark kind of emphasizes those things, but at the same time he's emphasizing this humanity of Jesus. He's talking about Jesus casts out demons, and he cures the blind, and he cleanses the lepers, and he raises the dead. He has power over nature. He can calm the sea. He walks on the water. He can speak to a fig tree and it withers. He knows what people are thinking. So you balance this Son of Man with this humanity of Jesus with this Son of Man, and he shows that that even Jesus, as he went through life, just not that he struggled with life, but he experienced life the way that we do. And Mark is very good about bringing that out. And there's a couple of really special characteristics too. Interestingly, in the book of Mark, Jesus only visits Jerusalem one time. And that relates to the way that he tells the story. When he tells the story, he tells the story about Jesus' ministry around Galilee, then his journey to go to Jerusalem, and then the time that he is in Jerusalem. Apple Watch is talking to us there. And then the time that he is in Jerusalem. So he kind of breaks it down into three sections. Don't want to be too dogmatic about that, but it's interesting the way that Mark does that. But again, it's the way that he's telling the story and what he wants people to understand. Mark is really compact. He is, what I mean in compact is that there are some stories that he gives a lot of vividness to and makes them bigger, but when he writes his gospel, he doesn't give a lot of fringe information outside that. For example, there is only one parable in Mark that is not either in Matthew or Luke, and that is the parable of the growing seed in Mark chapter 4, verse 26. Let me pull that up for you really quick so you can see it's a very short parable. This is the only parable that is unique to Mark. It's the parable of the seed growing. The kingdom of God is if a man should scatter seed on the ground, and he sleeps, and he rises night and day, and the seed sprouts and grows, and he knows not how. The earth produces by itself first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. But when the grain is ripe, at once he puts it in the sickle, because the harvest has come. But outside of that, another really interesting thing about the book of Mark, Mark only has 4 parables. Only 4. Matthew has 19 parables. Luke has 27 parables. So Mark is not as much about the teaching of Jesus as what Jesus is doing. One of his favorite words in the book, it occurs 42 times, is a Greek word that just means immediately. Jesus did this immediately. Jesus did this immediately. Jesus did this immediately. This happened immediately. Jesus did this, and it occurs over and over and over in the book. And it's almost, if you could look at Mark and say Mark is like the action gospel. I mean, if you wanted to go see an action movie, Mark is the action movie of the 4 gospels. He mostly about what Jesus did. It's quick. It's moving. There's a vividness about it as he teaches the story. We'll look at a couple of examples of that in just a few minutes. The first 11 chapters, every one of the first 11 chapters contain at least one miracle story. So where some of the other gospels have more information, for example, about something that Jesus taught, Mark has more information about something that Jesus did. All right. So all I wanted you to see on this slide is that word vividness. So all of that other stuff, I'm sorry, is just on a slide that I copied and pasted. So if I could take that off really quick, I would. So there is this vividness that Mark shows that a lot of the other gospels do not. And I'm going to try to show you. I'm going to try to show you some examples of this. So let me explain what I have on the screen. On the screen is a gospel parallel. So this section is Matthew. This section is Mark. And this section is Luke. And I want to go through, and I don't know how many of these we'll have time for. I guess as many as we want to do, or until you get tired of hearing them. You can send me a message. I want to show you just a couple, maybe more than a couple, ways that this vividness that I'm talking about in Mark, because I think this is really one of his special characteristics. So Mark chapter 1, 29 through 31 is when Jesus went to Peter's house and he heals Peter's mother-in-law. And here Matthew says he touched her hand. But Mark is going to give, he's going to be a little more exact about it. So he went to her and he took her hand. And I know that's just a little bit of a difference, but it's kind of a really interesting an interesting difference. If you look at 133, this is when many are demon possessed and they've been brought to Jesus, and Jesus, for example, this is Matthew. When evening came, many who were demon possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. But again, John Mark tells this vivid story like you're engaged in the story. So he adds this little section, the whole town was gathered at the door. So it's little things like that Luke will bring out that some of the other writers will not bring out in hardly the same kind of detail. Sorry about that. And when they bring the paralytic to Jesus, and of course this story's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay? So Matthew just says things like, some men brought to him a paralytic lying on a mat, and when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." Luke will add a little bit more. Some men carrying a paralytic on a mat and tried to take him into the house, but they couldn't find a way to do that here, so they went up to the roof and lowered the man through on the mat. But Peter will go in, Mark, maybe from Peter's perspective, will go into more detail. So many had gathered that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. And some men came bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 of them, and since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus, and digging through it, lowered the mat the paralyzed man was lying on. So, he'll give you that detail about they dug through the roof, or they carried him up on the roof, or about how many men there were. So, it's that kind of vividness that I think he really adds when he is... Now, if France is writing, they're actually reading this, man, that would be the kind of gospel you'd want to read because it keeps you engaged in the story. This is when he heals the man with the shriveled hand. And this is the kind of detail that Mark adds that the other writers don't add. He looked around at them in anger, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So, in the other Gospels, he just says, "Stretch out your hand." But Mark gives us that vividness about, Jesus is angry and he's deeply distressed and they have stubborn hearts. So he has to do this. In Mark chapter 4, they're going to the other side of... and this furious storm comes up on the lake, and the waves swamped the boat and swept over the boat, and Jesus was sleeping, and the disciples say, "Hey, get up and save us," right? And but Mark gives us more detail. Jesus was in the stern. Get rid of that. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion, and the disciples woke him and said, "Lord, teacher, don't you care if we drown?" So he gives more of this idea of exactly what Jesus was doing. Just the detail that he adds to the story. And it's not about Jesus teaching, it's really about what he was doing. Another one, Mark chapter 5. This section about healing the people at the tomb. We already talked about that one a little bit. We'll skip that one for right now. Mark 6. And this is a real interesting thing that Mark gives us detail to. This is what he kind of adds to the story. This is about John the Baptist and his death, and Herodias, and the thing that Mark adds is, so Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him but she was not able to because Herod feared John and protected him. So they tell us that Herod feared John, but Mark adds that little section of storytelling. Oh, she nursed a grudge, and so he gives us that kind of little information, and I think that's what makes Mark so incredibly special. Mark chapter 6, verse 48. This is when they are, Jesus is going to walk on the lake and walk on the water, and the boat is out, and there's a storm, and they're buffeted by the winds, and that's what the other gospels say. You know, they're a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the winds. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters had grown rough, and in John here, they rowed 3.5 miles. But Mark, again, in his storytelling way, he writes, he saw the disciples straining against the oars because the wind was against them. And about the fourth night of the watch, he went out to them walking on the lake as he was about to pass them by. So it's that straining of the oars. It's that little bit of special information that he gives you that kind of engages you in the story and engages you in what's going on. So that's the vividness I'm talking about. For example, when Jesus tells them to be on watch against the yeast of the Pharisees, and Matthew writes, well, the disciples forgot to take bread. And Mark, he engages you in the story just a little bit more. He said the disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Okay, so he relates the story in a way that try to engage you in it. I hope you're not getting tired of looking at these, but this is the vividness that I wanted you to see. Mark chapter 9, verse 18. Jesus has been up, and it's the transfiguration. They come out, and there is this, a man in the crowd has brought his son who's possessed by a spirit that's robbed him of speech. And that in Matthew it tells you he has seizures and he's suffering greatly, falls in a fire or water. And here it tells you about the convulsions. But again, Mark gives you that extra little detail. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth and gnashes his teeth and becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to drive it out, but they could not. And and here Luke also tells you about the foaming at the mouth and stuff, but it's just the way that Mark engages you in the story as he does those kind of things. See if I had any other. Mark chapter 11, verse 16. This is when Jesus is cleansing the temple, and Matthew and Luke both tell you that he entered the temple area and drives out those who are selling. Same thing here, but Mark gives you this extra little piece of information and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. So Mark gives you that little information of a Jesus who, he's overturned that, but then he's not going to let anybody carry stuff in or out of the temple either, because he's so upset about the things that are going on. Mark chapter 14, verse 3. This is at the home of Simon the leper, and she broke the jar and put the perfume on his head. So Mark gives you that little extra about breaking the jar. So as you read through the Gospel of Mark, one thing that you're going to find is just this vividness about the story. He's going to give you those extra little details that kind of engage you and try to draw you into what's happening. And I think, again, R.T. France may be right. Maybe this was designed to be read and people to engage in the stories. You could also, if John Mark is writing from Peter's perspective, which I think he is, okay. Another thing conclusion you could draw from that is Peter was probably a pretty fiery, engaging speaker as he drew people into the story of all the things that he had done with Jesus and the things that he had seen. It's not that he just gave you the facts. He was a really great storyteller. And again, Mark is not as much about the teaching, it's more about the action. Remember when we talked about John Mark painting Jesus as a human being. It's about the ministry of Jesus and the humanness of Jesus and how Jesus engaged in the world, that he was hungry and thirsty and tired, but at the same time that his actions and his works, that he was casting out demons and healing the sick. So Mark is it's the action movie of the Gospels. It's the one that gives you the little bit of detail to really get you involved and to keep you involved and give you the little bits of the story that it engages you right into the heart of the story. And it's fast moving. He moves from one section to the next section to the next section, not necessarily in a chronological order, but just in just kind of snippets. Somebody explained it one time as sandwiches. It's like Mark is putting one sandwich on top of the other, and it's just boom, 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 like slices of bread. And I think that's pretty good representation of what he was doing. So Mark is really special for that reason. It's the shortest of the Gospels. One of the reasons we covered it first, and maybe Matthew and Luke used some of Mark's information. Maybe they all have the same stories who are passed from generation to generation, and all of these stories that are told about Jesus. I don't know how all of that worked. That's an entirely different class. Okay, maybe we can do that sometime and get into a lot of that detail. But just remember that quick acting vividness of Peter, who's writing to a group of Christians who are probably, and most likely the majority of them in Rome and Italy, also Greek believers, but they don't have a real background of everything that happens in Palestine. They don't understand all of the Aramaic words, so he has to use some loan words and some explanations so they'll understand what's going on. We can't really finish the gospel without talking about this last section, and that is most people who, when you think about Mark, you're reading in your Bible. Let me switch over to another Bible program right here. You get to Mark chapter 16. I'm sure you know what we're going to talk about. And so you get to Mark chapter 16. It's the end of the book. Just back up a little bit. In chapter 16, you have the resurrection. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, so on. They break spices. They go to the grave. They're wondering who's going to roll. And again, that's kind of Mark in the way he relates the story, right? And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb? And so he's engaging you in the story. And they look up and they see this young man sitting there. He's on the right side. He's dressed in a white robe. Just don't be alarmed. You see Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's not here. He's risen. Tell his disciples and Peter. And I think that's really interesting. But go tell his disciples and Peter, and if Mark is writing from Peter's perspective, that makes perfect sense. And Peter, that he's going before you into Galilee, and you'll see him just as he told you. And they went out, reading right here, verse 8, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's an interesting ending for the book, isn't it? Now, I know you've got this section here. Some of the earliest manuscripts do not include this. We're going to talk about that. But if this is the actual ending of the book, that's really a strange ending to the Gospels. But honestly, I think that's probably the ending that John Mark wrote. I think that's it. Now, there are four... I'm going to go over here to, I want to go to this resource. This is Metzger's commentary on the text of the New Testament. And I want you to see this because I am not a textual criticism expert. I mean, I can look at different things and get information, but he does such a great job of explaining this that I wanted you to see it. there are four endings of the gospel according to Mark in current manuscripts. All right, so here are the four endings that are present. The last 12 verses of the commonly received text of Mark are absent from the two oldest Greek manuscripts, which are Sinaiticus and B. And if you click on this, this is a 4th century document. B is also a 4th century document. From the Latin Codex, it's missing there, the Sinaitic Syriac manuscript, and about 100 Armenian manuscripts, and the two oldest Georgian manuscripts. So this section that we are looking at right here, what he's telling you is this 16, 9 through 20 is missing in the majority of the oldest manuscripts that we have. So, sorry, I got onto the wrong text there. So, okay, and then about that he says, not a few manuscripts that contain the passage have scribal notes stating that older Greek copies lack it, and in other witnesses the passage is marked with an asterisk and oblique, the conventional signs used by copyists to indicate a spurious addition to a document. So most of the manuscripts that we have either do not have 10 through the end of the chapter, or they have it, but with some kind of notation that it probably wasn't original. Now, there are some manuscripts that have, let me see if I can explain this to you. After verse 8, right here, they have a verse that occurs between these two verses. And this is what the verse says. It says, but they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after these things, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So that's in some manuscripts. The difficulty with that, we'll get to that in a second. So then you have this traditional ending, which is 9 through 20. And I hope I'm not losing you with all of this. The traditional ending is present in all of these witnesses right here. Okay? But the difficulty is, except for this is a 5th century, this is a 5th century, and this is 5th century, and then you get into 9th and 10th century documents. This 4th and 5th century document actually has another addition in it. So the 4th section is this particular codex right here has this other verse added right here. This whole section right here added. So you've got four big endings. So I'm pretty much in agreement with Metzger here. It is obvious that the expanded form of the long ending has no claim to be original. So this is this one in this codex, so that one's not original. The longer ending, even though it's in a variety of witnesses and some of them ancient, there's some reasons that it doesn't seem to fit with the rest of Mark. Some of it is content. Another thing is, I know you can't read these Greek words right here. All of these Greek words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, actually 9, this is a phrase. Those words don't occur anywhere else in Mark. And then all of a sudden they show up in these verses 9 through 20. So it seems like he's got a different kind of vocabulary. The style is written a little bit different. It just doesn't seem to be the same type of writing when you look at this section. Now, there's nothing great theologically in that section. It doesn't change the gospel in any way. It just doesn't seem to be that they were original. You have to figure out, if there are you have this ending, which I think is original, and then you have three other endings, which are all different. And so what you have to start trying to figure out is, okay, if this was in here originally, how would it have gotten left out? Which probably isn't the case, because if it had gotten left out, it got left out of the earlier documents, not the later documents. If it did end this way, you could kind of figure why some people wanted to kind of like maybe give it an ending that's a little different. You hate to end a book, for they were afraid. Maybe we're missing the last page, but probably not the last page out of multiple manuscripts. Some of the early Christian writers, the church fathers, didn't comment on these sections, so they did not know that it existed. So I think somewhere, I think it actually ends right here. I think it ends with verse 8. And I know that's kind of a strange ending for a book, but I think that's exactly what happened. And I just want you to be aware of that, because when you pick up a translation now, most of them have something like this with the English Standard Version. If you look at their comments, this is most likely what you will find in a comment. Some manuscripts in the book with 16:8. Others include verses 9 through 20 immediately after verse 8. At least one manuscript inserts additional material after verse 14, which is the longer reading I showed you a few minutes ago. And some manuscripts include after the verse 8 to the following, but they reported briefly to Peter and those with him, and after they've been told, and that we were reading. One thing that's interesting, if it is original, is we're talking about Mary Magdalene in 16:1. And we're talking about her being at the tomb and in this whole section. Then it's interesting in verse 9. Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. And she went and told those who had been with him, and they mourned and wept. But what he is telling in verse 9 is the same thing he's already told us in 1 through 8. So it's like he adds a little synopsis and then gives an ending. So I really do think that it ends at 16:9. And I don't think 16:8. I don't think 9 through 20 were the original part of the text. I hope that was, man, it's been an hour. Sorry about that. Kept you a long time tonight. So, hey, I hope that kind of gave you a really good brief introduction to Mark, and some things to really look out for with that. Sunday morning, we'll be live streaming worship at 10 o'clock. Do you know a man at the pool? It's going to be taken from John chapter 5. We're talking about all being one, and how we come from different backgrounds, how we come from different situations. So we're looking at people Jesus encountered in the Gospel of John. So read John chapter 5 before Sunday morning. We'll talk about the man at the pool. Bible class at 9 o'clock. We are talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 33 and 34. Very interesting text that I hope you will give us your input on. And thanks for joining for the 4 Gospels of Mark. And sorry I kept you late tonight, but it's a really interesting book. I hope I have fueled the fire in you enough that you go back, you read the book of Mark, and just notice just the masterful job he does at telling the story. So have a great evening, and I will see you Sunday morning, and Jeff will be here to stream